Hello, and welcome to Bitesized Audio on YouTube. I'm Simon Stanhope, actor, audiobook narrator, and curator of this channel. On the channel, I narrate classic short stories, mostly from the Victorian and Edwardian eras, including vintage ghost stories, detective stories, and other classic tales of mystery and suspense. I put notes in the video description with some background information on the authors and the stories if you'd like to read more, and you'll also find links to playlists and podcast series, as well as some compilation videos if you'd like a longer listen. If you enjoy this content, please subscribe, like, share, leave a comment if you'd like to, and thank you for listening. The Brighton Mystery by Emma Orczy. Read by Simon Stanhope. "Do you care for the seaside?" asked the man in the corner when he had finished his lunch. "I don't mean the seaside at Ostend or Trouville, but honest English seaside, with 3-shilling excursionists and dirty, expensive furnished apartments, where they charge you a shilling for lighting the hall gas on Sundays and 6pence on other evenings. Do you care for that?" "I prefer the country." "Ah, perhaps it is preferable. Personally, I only liked one of our English seaside resorts once, and that was for a week, when Edward Skinner was up before the magistrate, charged with what was known as the Brighton outrage. I don't know if you remember the memorable day in Brighton, memorable for that elegant town, which deals more in amusements than mysteries, when Mr. Francis Morton, one of its most noted residents, disappeared. Yes, disappeared as completely as any vanishing lady in a music hall. He was wealthy, had a fine house, servants, a wife and children, and he disappeared. There was no getting away from that. Mr. Francis Morton lived with his wife in one of the large houses in Sussex Square, at the Kemp Town end of Brighton. Mrs. Morton was well known for her Americanisms, her swagger dinner parties, and beautiful Paris gowns. She was the daughter of one of the many American millionaires. I think her father was a Chicago pork butcher, who conveniently provide wealthy wives for English gentlemen, and she had married Mr. Francis Morton a few years ago, and brought him her $250,000, for no other reason but that she fell in love with him. He was neither good-looking nor distinguished. In fact, he was one of those men who seem to have City stamped all over their person. He was a gentleman of very regular habits, going up to London every morning on business, and returning every afternoon by the husband's train. So regular was he in these habits that all the servants of the Sussex Square house were betrayed into actual gossip over the fact that on Wednesday, March 17th, the master was not home for dinner. Hales, the butler, remarked that the mistress seemed a bit anxious and didn't eat much food. The evening wore on, and Mr. Morton did not appear. At 9 o'clock, the young footman was dispatched to the station to make inquiries whether his master had been seen there in the afternoon, or whether, which heaven forbid, there had been an accident on the line. The young man interviewed 2 or 3 porters, the bookstall boy and ticket clerk. All were agreed that Mr. Morton did not go up to London during the day. No one had seen him within the precincts of the station. There certainly had been no accident reported, either on the up or down line. But the morning of the 18th came, with its initial postman's knock, but neither Mr. Morton nor any sign of news from him. Mrs. Morton, who evidently had spent a sleepless night, for she looked sadly changed and haggard, sent a wire to the hall porter at the large building in Cannon Street, where her husband had his office. An hour later she had the reply, "Not seen Mr. Morton all day yesterday, not here today." By the afternoon, Everyone in Brighton knew that a fellow resident had mysteriously disappeared from or in the city. A couple of days, then another, elapsed, and still no sign of Mr. Morton. The police were doing their best. The gentleman was so well known in Brighton, as he had been a resident 2 years, that it was not difficult to firmly establish the one fact that he had not left the city, since no one saw him in the station on the morning of the 17th, nor at any time since then. Mild excitement prevailed throughout the town. At first, the newspapers took the matter somewhat jocosely. "Where is Mr. Morton?" was the usual placard on the evening's contents bills. But after 3 days had gone by, and the worthy Brighton resident was still missing, while Mrs. Morton was seen to look more haggard and careworn every day, mild excitement gave place to anxiety. There were vague hints now as to foul play. The news had leaked out that the missing gentleman was carrying a large sum of money on the day of his disappearance. There were also vague rumours of a scandal, not unconnected with Mrs. Morton herself, and her own past history, which, in her anxiety for her husband, she had been forced to reveal to the detective inspector in charge of the case. Then, on Saturday, the news which the late evening papers contained was this. Acting on certain information received, the police today forced an entrance into one of the rooms of Russell House, a high-class furnished apartment on the King's Parade, and there they discovered our missing distinguished townsman, Mr. Francis Morton, who had been robbed and subsequently locked up in that room since Wednesday, the 17th. When discovered, he was in the last stages of inanition. He was tied into an armchair with ropes. A thick wool shawl had been wound round his mouth, and it is a positive marvel that, left thus without food and very little air, the unfortunate gentleman survived the horrors of these 4 days of incarceration. He has been conveyed to his residence in Sussex Square, and we are pleased to say that Dr. Mellish, who is in attendance, has declared his patient to be out of serious danger, and that, with care and rest, he will be soon quite himself again. At the same time, our readers will learn with unmixed satisfaction that the police of our city, with their usual acuteness and activity, have already discovered the identity and whereabouts of the cowardly ruffian who committed this unparalleled outrage. "I really don't know," continued the man in the corner, blandly, "what it was that interested me in the case from the very first. Certainly it had nothing very out of the way or mysterious about it, but I journeyed down to Brighton nevertheless, as I felt that something deeper and more subtle lay behind that extraordinary assault, following a robbery, no doubt. I must tell you that the police had allowed it to be freely circulated abroad that they held a clue. It had been easy enough to ascertain who the lodger was who had rented the furnished room in Russell House. His name was supposed to be Edward Skinner, and he had taken the room about a fortnight ago, but had gone away, ostensibly for 2 or 3 days, on the very day of Mr. Morton's mysterious disappearance. It was on the 20th that Mr. Morton was found, and 36 hours later the public were gratified to hear that Mr. Edward Skinner had been traced to London and arrested on the charge of assault upon the person of Mr. Francis Morton, and of robbing him of the sum of £10,000. Then a further sensation was added to the already bewildering case by the startling announcement that Mr. Francis Morton refused to prosecute. Of course, the Treasury took up the case and subpoenaed Mr. Morton as a witness, so that gentleman, if he wished to hush the matter up, or had been in any way terrorized into a promise of doing so, gained nothing by his refusal, except an additional amount of curiosity in the public mind, and further sensation around the mysterious case. It was all this, you see, which had interested me, and brought me down to Brighton on March 23rd, to see the prisoner, Edward Skinner, arraigned before the beak. I must say that he was a very ordinary-looking individual, fair, of ruddy complexion, with snub nose and the beginning of a bald place on the top of his head. He, too, looked the embodiment of a prosperous, stodgy city gent. I took a quick survey of the witnesses present, and guessed that the handsome, stylish woman sitting next to Mr. Reginald Pepys, the noted lawyer for the Crown, was Mrs. Morton. There was a large crowd in court, and I heard whispered comments among the feminine portion thereof as to the beauty of Mrs. Morton's gown, the value of her large picture hat, and the magnificence of her diamond rings. The police gave all the evidence required with regard to the finding of Mr. Morton in the room at Russell House, and also to the arrest of Skinner at the Langham Hotel in London. It appears that the prisoner seemed completely taken aback at the charge preferred against him, and declared that though he knew Mr. Francis Morton slightly in business, he knew nothing as to his private life. "Prisoner stated," continued Inspector Buckle, "that he was not even aware Mr. Morton lived in Brighton. But I have evidence here, which I will place before your honour, to prove that the prisoner was seen in the company of Mr. Morton at 9:30 o'clock on the morning of the assault." Cross-examined by Mr. Matthew Quiller, the detective inspector admitted that prisoner merely said that he did not know that Mr. Morton was a resident of Brighton. He never denied having met him there. The witness, or rather witnesses, referred to by the police, were two Brighton tradesmen who knew Mr. Morton by sight and had seen him on the morning of the 17th, walking with the accused. In this instance, Mr. Quiller had no question to ask of the witnesses, and it was generally understood that the prisoner did not wish to contradict their statement. Constable Hartrick told the story of the finding of the unfortunate Mr. Morton after his 4 days' incarceration. The constable had been sent round by the chief inspector, after certain information given by Mrs. Chapman, the landlady of Russell House. He had found the door locked, and forced it open. Mr. Morton was in an armchair, with several yards of rope wound loosely round him. He was almost unconscious, and there was a thick wool shawl tied round his mouth, which must have deadened any cry or groan the poor gentleman might have uttered. But, as a matter of fact, the constable was under the impression that Mr. Morton had been either drugged or stunned in some way at first, which had left him weak and faint, and prevented him from making himself heard, or extricating himself from his bonds, which were very clumsily, evidently very hastily, wound round his body. The medical officer who was called in, and also Dr. Mellish, who attended Mr. Morton, both said that he seemed dazed by some stupefying drug, and also, of course, terribly weak and faint with the want of food. The first witness of real importance was Mrs. Chapman, the proprietress of Russell House, whose original information to the police led to the discovery of Mr. Morton. In answer to Mr. Pepys, she said that on March 1st the accused called at her house and gave his name as Mr. Edward Skinner. He required, he said, a furnished room at a moderate rental for a permanency, with full attendance when he was in, but he added that he would often be away for 2 or 3 days, or even longer at a time. "He told me that he was a traveller for a tea-house," continued Mrs. Chapman, "and I showed him the front room on the 3rd floor, as he did not want to pay more than 12 shillings a week. I asked him for a reference, but he put 3 sovereigns in my hand, and said with a laugh that he supposed paying for his room a month in advance was sufficient reference. If I didn't like him after that, I could give him a week's notice to quit." "You did not think of asking him the name of the firm for which he travelled?" asked Mr. Pepys. "No, I was quite satisfied, as he paid me for the room. The next day he sent in his luggage and took possession of the room. He went out most mornings on business, but was always in Brighton for Saturday and Sunday. On the 16th he told me that he was going to Liverpool for a couple of days. He slept in the house that night and went off early on the 17th, taking his portmanteau with him." "At what time did he leave?" asked Mr. Pepys. "I couldn't say exactly," replied Mrs. Chapman, with some hesitation. "You see, this is the off-season here. None of my rooms are let, except the one to Mr. Skinner, and I only have one servant. I keep 4 during the summer, autumn, and winter season," she added with conscious pride, fearing that her former statement might prejudice the reputation of Russell House. "I thought I had heard Mr. Skinner go out about 9 o'clock, but about an hour later the girl and I were both in the basement, and we heard the front door open and shut with a bang, and then a step in the hall." "That's Mr. Skinner," said Mary. "So it is," I said. "Why, I thought he had gone an hour ago." "He did go out then," said Mary, "for he left his bedroom door open, and I went in to do his bed and tidy his room." "Just go and see if that's him, Mary," I said, and Mary ran up to the hall and up the stairs, and came back to tell me that was Mr. Skinner all right enough. He had gone straight up to his room. Mary didn't see him, but he had another gentleman with him, as she could hear them talking in Mr. Skinner's room. "Then you can't tell us at what time the prisoner left the house finally?" "No, that I can't. I went out shopping soon after that. When I came in it was 12 o'clock. I went up to the 3rd floor and found that Mr. Skinner had locked his door and taken the key with him. As I knew Mary had already done the room, I did not trouble more about it, though I did think it strange for a gentleman to lock up his room and not leave the key with me." "And, of course, you heard no noise of any kind in the room then?" "No, not that day or the next. But on the 3rd day, Mary and I both thought we heard a funny sound. I said that Mr. Skinner had left his window open, and it was the blind flapping against the window pane. But when we heard that funny noise again, I put my ear to the keyhole, and I thought I could hear a groan. I was very frightened, and sent Mary for the police." Mrs. Chapman had nothing more of interest to say. The prisoner certainly was her lodger. She had last seen him on the evening of the 16th, going up to his room with his candle. Mary, the servant, had much the same story to relate as her mistress. "I think it was him, right enough," said Mary, guardedly. "I didn't see him, but I went up to his landing and stopped a moment outside his door. I could hear loud voices in the room, gentlemen talking." "I suppose you would not do such a thing as to listen, Mary?" queried Mr. Pepys, with a smile. "No, sir," said Mary, with a bland smile. "I didn't catch what the gentleman said, but one of them spoke so loud I thought they must be quarrelling." "Mr. Skinner was the only person in possession of a latchkey, I presume. No one else could have come in without ringing at the door?" "Oh, no, sir." That was all. So far, you see, the case was progressing splendidly for the Crown against the prisoner. The contention, of course, was that Mr. Skinner had met Mr. Morton, brought him home with him, assaulted, drugged, then gagged and bound him, and finally robbed him of whatever money he had in his possession, which, according to certain affidavits, which presently would be placed before the magistrate, amounted to £10,000 in notes. But in all this there still remained the great element of mystery, for which the public and the magistrate would demand an explanation. Namely, what were the relationships between Mr. Morton and Skinner, which had induced the former to refuse the prosecution of the man who had not only robbed him, but had so nearly succeeded in leaving him to die a terrible and lingering death. Mr. Morton was too ill as yet to appear in person. Dr. Mellish had absolutely forbidden his patient to undergo the fatigue and excitement of giving evidence himself in court that day, but his depositions had been taken at his bedside, were sworn to by him, and were now placed before the magistrate by the prosecuting counsel, and the facts they revealed were certainly as remarkable as they were brief and enigmatical. As they were read by Mr. Pepys, an awed and expectant hush seemed to descend over the large crowd gathered there, and all necks were strained eagerly forward to catch a glimpse of a tall, elegant woman, faultlessly dressed, and wearing exquisite jewellery, but whose handsome face wore, as the prosecuting counsel read her husband's deposition, a more and more ashen hue. "This, Your Honour, is the statement made upon oath by Mr. Francis Morton, commenced Mr. Pepys, in that loud, sonorous voice of his, which sounds so impressive in a crowded and hushed court. "I was obliged, for certain reasons which I refuse to disclose, to make a payment of a large sum of money to a man whom I did not know and have never seen. It was in a matter of which my wife was cognizant, and which had entirely to do with her own affairs. I was merely the go-between, as I thought it was not fit that she should see to this matter herself. The individual in question had made certain demands, of which she kept me in ignorance so long as she could, not wishing to unnecessarily worry me. At last she decided to place the whole matter before me, and I agreed with her that it would be best to satisfy the man's demands. I then wrote to that individual, whose name I do not wish to disclose, addressing the letter, as my wife directed me to do, to the Brighton post office, saying that I was ready to pay the £10,000 to him at any place or time, and in what manner he might appoint. I received a reply which bore the Brighton postmark, and which desired me to be outside Furnival's, the drapers, in West Street, at 9:30 on the morning of March 17th, and to bring the money, £10,000, in Bank of England notes. On the 16th my wife gave me a cheque for the amount, and I cashed it at her bank, Bird's, in Fleet Street. At 9:30 the following morning I was at the appointed place. An individual wearing a grey overcoat, bowler hat, and red tie accosted me by name, and requested me to walk as far as his lodgings in the King's Parade. I followed him. Neither of us spoke. He stopped at a house which bore the name Russell House, and which I shall be able to swear to as soon as I am able to go out. He let himself in with a latchkey, and asked me to follow him up to his room on the 3rd floor. I thought I noticed, when we were in the room, that he locked the door. However, I had nothing of any value about me except the £10,000, which I was ready to give him. We had not exchanged the slightest word. I gave him the notes, and he folded them and put them in his pocket-book. Then I turned towards the door, and, without the slightest warning, I felt myself suddenly gripped by the shoulder, while a handkerchief was pressed to my nose and mouth. I struggled as best I could, but the handkerchief was saturated with chloroform, and I soon lost consciousness. I hazily remember the man saying to me, in short, jerky sentences, spoken at intervals, while I was still weakly struggling, "What a fool you must think me, my dear sir. Did you really think that I was going to let you quietly walk out of here, straight to the police station, eh? Such dodges have been done before, I know, when a man's silence has to be bought for money. Find out who he is, see where he lives, give him the money, then inform against him. No, you don't, not this time. I am off to the Continent with this £10,000, and I can get to Newhaven in time for the midday boat, so you'll have to keep quiet until I am the other side of the Channel, my friend. You won't be much inconvenienced. My landlady will hear your groans presently and release you, so you'll be all right. There now, drink this. That's better." He forced something bitter down my throat. Then I remember nothing more. When I regained consciousness, I was sitting in an armchair with some rope tied round me and a wool shawl round my mouth. I hadn't the strength to make the slightest effort to disentangle myself or to utter a scream. I felt terribly sick and faint. Mr. Reginald Pepys had finished reading, and no one in that crowded court had thought of uttering a sound. The magistrate's eyes were fixed upon the handsome lady in the magnificent gown, who was mopping her eyes with a dainty lace handkerchief. The extraordinary narrative of the victim of so daring an outrage had kept everyone in suspense. One thing was still expected to make the measure of sensation as full as it had ever been over any criminal case, and that was Mrs. Morton's evidence. She was called by the prosecuting counsel, and slowly, gracefully, she entered the witness-box. There was no doubt that she had felt keenly the tortures which her husband had undergone, and also the humiliation of seeing her name dragged forcibly into this ugly, blackmailing scandal. Closely questioned by Mr. Reginald Pepys, she was forced to admit that the man who blackmailed her was connected with her early life in a way which would have brought terrible disgrace upon her, and upon her children. The story she told, amidst many tears and sobs, and much use of her beautiful lace handkerchief and beringed hands, was exceedingly pathetic. It appears that when she was barely 17, she was inveigled into a secret marriage with one of those foreign adventurers who swarm in every country, and who styled himself Comte Armand de la Trémouille. He seems to have been a blackguard of unusually low pattern, for, after he had extracted from her some £200 of her pin money and a few diamond brooches, he left her one fine day with a laconic word to say that he was sailing for Europe by the Argentina, and would not be back for some time. She was in love with the brute, poor young soul, for when, a week later, she read that the Argentina was wrecked, and presumably every soul on board had perished, she wept very many bitter tears over her early widowhood. Fortunately, her father, a very wealthy pork butcher of Chicago, had known nothing of his daughter's culpable foolishness. 4 years later, he took her to London, where she met Mr. Francis Morton and married him. She led 6 or 7 years of very happy married life, when one day, like a thunderbolt from a clear blue sky, she received a typewritten letter, signed Armand de la Trémouille, full of protestations of undying love, telling a long and pathetic tale of years of suffering in a foreign land, whither he had drifted after having been rescued, almost miraculously, from the wreck of the Argentina, and where he had never been able to scrape a sufficient amount of money to pay for his passage home. At last fate had favoured him. He had, after many vicissitudes, found the whereabouts of his dear wife, and was now ready to forgive all that was past, and take her to his loving arms once again. What followed was the usual course of events when there is a blackguard and a fool of a woman. She was terrorized, and did not dare to tell her husband for some time. She corresponded with the Comte de la Trémouille, begging him for her sake, and in memory of the past, not to attempt to see her. She found him amenable to reason in the shape of several £100, which passed through the Brighton post office into his hands. At last, one day, by accident, Mr. Morton came across one of the Comte de la Trémouille's interesting letters. She confessed everything, throwing herself upon her husband's mercy. Now, Mr. Francis Morton was a businessman who viewed life practically and soberly. He liked his wife, who kept him in luxury and wished to keep her, whereas the Comte de la Trémouille seemed willing enough to give her up for a consideration. Mrs. Morton, who had the sole and absolute control of her fortune, on the other hand, was willing enough to pay the price and hush up the scandal, which she believed, since she was a bit of a fool, would land her in prison for bigamy. Mr. Francis Morton wrote to the Comte de la Trémouille that his wife was ready to pay him the sum of £10,000, which he demanded in payment for her absolute liberty, and his own complete disappearance out of her life, now and forever. The appointment was made, and Mr. Morton left his house at 9 a.m. on March 17th, with the £10,000 in his pocket. The public and the magistrate had hung breathless upon her words. There was nothing but sympathy felt for this handsome woman, who throughout had been more sinned against than sinning, and whose gravest fault seems to have been a total lack of intelligence in dealing with her own life. But I can assure you of one thing, that in no case within my recollection was there ever such a sensation in a court, as when the magistrate, after a few minutes' silence, said gently to Mrs. Morton, "And now, Mrs. Morton, will you kindly look at the prisoner, and tell me if, in him, you recognize your former husband?" And she, without even turning to look at the accused, said quietly, "Oh, no, Your Honour. Of course, that man is not the Comte de la Trémouille." "I can assure you that the situation was quite dramatic," continued the man in the corner, whilst his funny, claw-like hands took up a bit of string with renewed feverishness. In answer to further questions from the magistrate, she declared that she had never seen the accused. He might have been the go-between, however, that she could not say. The letters she received were all typewritten, but signed Armand de la Trémouille, and certainly the signature was identical with that on the letters she used to receive from him years ago, all of which she had kept. "And did it never strike you," asked the magistrate with a smile, "that the letters you received might be forgeries?" "How could they be?" she replied decisively. "No one knew of my marriage to the Comte de la Trémouille, no one in England, certainly. And besides, if someone did know the Comte intimately enough to forge his handwriting and to blackmail me, why should that someone have waited all these years? I have been married 7 years, Your Honour." That was true enough, and there the matter rested, as far as he was concerned. But the identity of Mr. Francis Morton's assailant had to be finally established, of course, before the prisoner was committed for trial. Dr. Mellish promised that Mr. Morton would be allowed to come to court for half an hour and identify the accused on the following day, and the case was adjourned until then. The accused was led away between 2 constables, bail being refused, and Brighton had perforce to moderate its impatience until the Wednesday. On that day, the court was crowded to overflowing. Actors, playwrights, literary men of all sorts had fought for admission to study for themselves the various phases and faces in connection with the case. Mrs. Morton was not present when the prisoner, quiet and self-possessed, was brought in and placed in the dock. His solicitor was with him, and a sensational defence was expected. Presently there was a stir in the court, and that certain sound, half rustle, half sigh, which preludes an expected palpitating event. Mr. Morton, pale, thin, wearing yet in his hollow eyes the stamp of those 5 days of suffering, walked into court leaning on the arm of his doctor. Mrs. Morton was not with him. He was at once accommodated with a chair in the witness-box, and the magistrate, after a few words of kindly sympathy, asked him if he had anything to add to his written statement. On Mr. Morton replying in the negative, the magistrate added, "And now, Mr. Morton, will you kindly look at the accused in the dock, and tell me whether you recognise the person who took you to the room in Russell House, and then assaulted you?" Slowly the sick man turned towards the prisoner and looked at him. Then he shook his head, and replied quietly, "No, sir, that certainly was not the man." "You are quite sure?" asked the magistrate in amazement, while the crowd literally gasped with wonder. "I swear it," asserted Mr. Morton. "Can you describe the man who assaulted you?" "Certainly. He was dark, of swarthy complexion, tall, thin, with bushy eyebrows, and thick black hair and short beard. He spoke English with just the faintest suspicion of a foreign accent. The prisoner, as I told you before, was English in every feature, English in his ruddy complexion, and absolutely English in his speech. After that, the case for the prosecution began to collapse. Everyone had expected a sensational defence, and Mr. Matthew Quiller, counsel for Skinner, fully justified all these expectations. He had no fewer than 4 witnesses present, who swore positively that at 9:45 a.m., on the morning of Wednesday, March 17th, the prisoner was in the express train leaving Brighton for Victoria. Not being endowed with the gift of being in 2 places at once, and Mr. Morton having added the whole weight of his own evidence in Mr. Edward Skinner's favour, That gentleman was once more remanded by the magistrate, pending further investigation by the police, bail being allowed this time in 2 sureties of £50 each. "Tell me what you think of it," said the man in the corner, seeing that Polly remained silent and puzzled. "Well," she replied dubiously, "I suppose that the so-called Armand de la Trémouille's story was true in substance, that he did not perish on the Argentina, but drifted home and blackmailed his former wife." "Doesn't it strike you that there are at least 2 very strong points against that theory?" he asked, making 2 gigantic knots in his piece of string. "2? Yes. In the first place, if the blackmailer was the Comte de la Trémouille, returned to life, why should he have been content to take £10,000 from a lady who was his lawful wife, and who could keep him in luxury for the rest of his natural life upon her large fortune, which was close upon £250,000? The real Comte de la Trémouille, remember, had never found it difficult to get money out of his wife during their brief married life, whatever Mr. Morton's subsequent experience in the same direction might have been. And secondly, why should he have typewritten his letters to his wife? Because that was a point which, to my mind, the police never made the most of. Now, my experience in criminal cases has invariably been that when a typewritten letter figures in one, that letter is a forgery. It is not very difficult to imitate a signature, but it is a jolly sight more difficult to imitate a handwriting throughout an entire letter. Then, do you think— "I think, if you will allow me," he interrupted excitedly, "that we will go through the points, the sensible, tangible points of the case. Firstly, Mr. Morton disappears with £10,000 in his pocket for 4 entire days. At the end of that time, he is discovered loosely tied to an armchair, and a wool shawl round his mouth. Secondly, a man named Skinner is accused of the outrage. Mr. Morton, although he himself is able, mind you, to furnish the best defence possible for Skinner, by denying his identity with the man who assaulted him, refuses to prosecute. Why? He did not wish to drag his wife's name into the case. He must have known that the Crown would take up the case. Then again, how is it that no one saw him in the company of the swarthy foreigner he described? 2 witnesses did see Mr. Morton in company with Skinner, argued Polly. Yes, at 9:20 in West Street. That would give Edward Skinner time to catch the 9:45 at the station, and to entrust Mr. Morton with the latchkey of Russell House, remarked the man in the corner dryly. "What nonsense!" Polly ejaculated. "Nonsense, is it?" he said, tugging wildly at his bit of string. "Is it nonsense to affirm that if a man wants to make sure that his victim shall not escape, he does not usually wind rope loosely round his figure, nor does he throw a wool shawl lightly round his mouth? The police were idiotic beyond words. They themselves discovered that Morton was so loosely fastened to his chair that very little movement would have disentangled him, and yet it never struck them that nothing was easier for that particular type of scoundrel to sit down in an armchair and wind a few yards of rope round himself, then, having wrapped a wool shawl round his throat, to slip his 2 arms inside the ropes. But what object would a man in Mr. Morton's position have for playing such extraordinary pranks? Ah, the motive. There you are. What do I always tell you? Seek the motive. Now, what was Mr. Morton's position? He was the husband of a lady who owned £250,000 of money, not 1 penny of which he could touch without her consent, as it was settled on herself, and who, after the terrible way in which he had been plundered, and then abandoned in her early youth, no doubt kept a very tight hold upon the purse-strings. Mr. Morton's subsequent life has proved that he had certain expensive, not altogether avowable tastes. One day he discovers the old love letters of the Comte Armand de la Trémouille. Then he lays his plans. He typewrites a letter, forges the signature of the erstwhile Count, and awaits events. The fish does rise to the bait. He gets sundry bits of money, and his success makes him daring. He looks round him for an accomplice, clever, unscrupulous, greedy, and selects Mr. Edward Skinner, probably some former pal of his Wild Oats days. The plan was very neat, you must confess. Mr. Skinner takes the room in Russell House, and studies all the manners and customs of his landlady and her servant. He then draws the full attention of the police upon himself. He meets Morton in West Street, then disappears, ostensibly after the assault. In the meanwhile, Morton goes to Russell House. He walks upstairs, talks loudly in the room, then makes elaborate preparations for his comedy. Why, he nearly died of starvation. Oh, that, I dare say, was not a part of his reckoning. He thought, no doubt, that Mrs. Chapman or the servant would discover and rescue him pretty soon. He meant to appear just a little faint, and endured quietly the first 24 hours of inanition. But the excitement and want of food told on him more than he expected. After 24 hours, he turned very giddy and sick, and, falling from one fainting fit into another, was unable to give the alarm. However, he is all right again now, and concludes his part of a downright blackguard to perfection. Under the plea that his conscience does not allow him to live with a lady whose first husband is still alive, he has taken a bachelor flat in London, and only pays afternoon calls on his wife in Brighton. But presently he will tire of his bachelor life, and will return to his wife. And I'll guarantee that the Comte de la Trémouille will never be heard of again. And that afternoon the man in the corner left Miss Polly Burton alone with a couple of photos of two uninteresting, stodgy, quiet-looking men, Morton and Skinner, who, if the old scarecrow was right in his theories, were a pair of the finest blackguards unhung. You've been listening to a bite-sized audiobook, read by me, Simon Stanhope. If you enjoy these stories and would like to help me to keep producing new content, you can find links in the video description to my Patreon page or to buy me a coffee. Another way to support me is through my Bandcamp page, bitesizedaudio.bandcamp.com, where you can hear my narrations of many more classic short stories, as well as purchase and download them to keep. This recording is copyright Bitesized Audio 2025. Thank you for listening.